giving me this opportunity. It's an honor and a privilege. Given our time constraints, I think I'm going to just jump right in. And I would like to start with you, Dr. Aфеյан. We have a mixed audience here. We have some data science students, some computer science students, but we have students who are not in the science field. We have some health professionals, public health and clinical medicine here. So for a varied audience, could you please describe to us what do you mean by data-driven bioscience? And can you give some examples to illustrate that?
Great. Well, first of all, I don't know if this is on. Yeah. It's great to be here. It's good to be back. And it's great to be talking about a topic like this, as opposed to many other things that we've talked about, but generally not science. When I've visited here, so it's a great opportunity. Biology as a field has got an important distinction in that the systems that we study are generally not human-made or elemental in their nature, and these are complex systems that have evolved. And as a result, there's been a big disadvantage in this field in making progress in that it's very hard often to figure out how these systems function because we don't really understand the logic of them. So for the longest time, biology has been largely an observational science, and like the other sciences, but the transition to a mechanistic understanding has been rather delayed, I would say. And more in the last 50 years of molecular cell biology, we've made some progress, but I would argue that progress has taught us just how little we know in increasing increments. In other words, every year we learn even more that we didn't know about than we did the previous year. So as a percentage of what we know exists and we don't understand, the number is getting, that percentage is getting larger, or the lower and lower the more we learn. So why I say all that is, so kind of how do you fix that? You either can figure out some kind of universal theory of evolution, which at a molecular level tells you exactly how we came to be, which I don't think is very logical, but if anybody wants to work on it, I'd be very interested to learn how. Or you measure at massive amounts of information at every scale, at every type of information, and you then have the problem of what do you do with all this information? That's what the data is. And of course, the more progress is made in developing algorithms that can deal with complex systems, the more you can now begin to use that data, even if we don't understand the underlying mechanisms, to begin to predict, model, influence biological systems. So data-driven bioscience, at least to me, whether it's applied to epidemiology, to disease, to health, to any number of things, is all about taking this kind of data, just attacking the problem with measurements and then being able to distill them down to some useful models with which to do things. So it's a long description of it. Probably there's a better one, but that's the way I would look at the topic.
Before I go on to ask Dr. Markey this next question, I just wondered if you could give our audience an example of something that has come out of data-driven bioscience recently.
A practical example and an important one is that there's a number of cancer drugs that only work on certain mutations that may or may not exist in cancer. If you give those drugs to people that don't have that mutation in their particular cancer, they will have no effect. And if you do, they will have a profound effect. First developing that drug and getting the FDA to allow you to use it, or any other EMA, whatever, and then being able to give it to the appropriate person is purely a data-driven act. The same example could be said about how we've dealt, and we can get into it later, with the whole COVID-19 situation, because that has been a massive data collection, data application in the development of vaccines, in the development of various other treatments. Without that level of data capability, things would go much slower. So those are examples.
Right, important. Both of them important and relatively recent. So Dr. Markey, how do you see a transformation of bioscience in higher education due to this big data handling? And again, if you could just mention, because we have such a varied audience, what do we really mean by big data?
Yes, of course, it's a dream come true for in this field and in science that so many years we have been studying the details between molecules and big molecules and small, and then to understand big molecules and how they really structured in a complexity of a cell or a membrane or whatever. It's very time consuming. So suddenly we have a possibility to, with pretty simple algorithms, to really use the building blocks like amino acids and just very fast get the right structure, three-dimensional structure of these complex molecules. And when we compare this structure that was done in that way with computers and a lot of data, then that also agrees with the structures that we have found with the old methods, with the cryo-electron microscopes, for instance, and mass spectrometry, so forth. So it's really, we can believe in it. So of course this is it's amazing for scientists, and of course it could also stress maybe some scientists that have had the skills that the young scientists come in there and just produce masses of data that goes beyond. But at the same time, I think it's important to realize also that physical structure is not everything that goes on. A biological system, like Nubbar was saying, also is very complex. So of course the complexity is also expressed by physics and chemistry on the details. Right. So to understand the big forest and everything that's in it quickly is of course a blessing and fantastic, but then it opens up to also be able to go further on the research and to understand the diversity, the details, and there are so many things, of course, that we, by more and more data, we can add to these and build and train these data systems, these algorithms, so that we probably can do much more. I would assume that we can understand complexes, also big molecules that change form in different environments. Maybe we could do a lot of that, but we I don't know what happened to my sound.
I think someone else was.
Think I talked too much?
No. It was not timed out. No. We're just getting started.
So I think it is important to see that there's even more now need to have also the sciences of physics, chemistry, math to come into and work together. So what we need to do now is learn how to work together with people that understand the data, that understand the system, understand the science, the context of the life science that we are looking at. So I think it's the collaboration between those are something that universities also have to deal with.
Right, in building that collaboration, even in the education.
I think in the education, because if you wait until you have your degree and you're out there and you go into the traditional world, it's quite difficult. So I think the universities, we have to really make people from different disciplines meet more and train those understanding of how to handle systems before you get on your own.
Right. And Dr. Afeய்yan, you've mentioned some of the greatest accomplishments, the greatest sort of advances recently, but what have been some of the biggest challenges in this field that you see in your career or in the field overall?
More.
Small question.
Yeah. Well, I assume you mean in the context of data-driven bioscience, because there's plenty of challenges in every other aspect of doing what we do, because affecting human physiology and health and sickness is the complexity grows when you're talking about humans, let alone their interaction with the environment, let alone millions of humans. I mean, that just the data problem doesn't stop. I mean, in fact, one of the interesting areas that I think is really, really fascinating, which COVID has taught us, but also now is being used in many other areas, like cancer I mentioned, is just human-level data. Because we've never had sequence data on humans coupled with their entire electronic records, coupled with all the medical measurements they've made in singular databases, which we now do. The UK has traced essentially millions of people, and they are using that data and they're making it available in an anonymized way to do research and to figure out things about disease we would be completely unable to know, but for the fact that the experiment's being run by virtue of our own diversity. So if you want to, like, one of the biggest areas of discovery that's been made over the last decade plus is that there are mutations among us, a subset of which make us predisposed to certain diseases. And if you have information on everybody, you can figure out the 322 people that have that mutation and get that kidney disease on a Tuesday because they took this drug. Boom, the data is there, you know what the mechanism is. Those are easy things, but they just pop out. Then there's much more complicated things that you can also do data combined with some limited experimentation. So there's a lot of things. I mean, the frustrating thing about it is you don't know what to measure. You don't know in what precision you have to measure it, because you're measuring it without an aim, right? This is largely unbiased measurements. You're collecting data, and then it's a little like, intelligence, in the real world, where that you kind of gather intelligence information, but you have no idea what signal you're looking for, and then you're training against that. Eventually, you might find a pattern that will tell you what to go look for, but when you gather the information to begin with, you just don't know. And those of you who don't work on this, every day, it's probably relevant to remember that, like, kind of, to me anyway, the central unit of computing, if you will, or processing in life is a cell, of which we have, hundreds of billions in our body. Before you get too excited about human cells, you should realize that the number of genes and genetic diversity we have in our body in the basis of bacteria is 1 or 2 orders of magnitude higher than what humans have in genes. So you could actually, genetic diversity of the bacteria in our bodies is vastly greater than the genetic diversity in our human cells. Even though we think we're the life form, there are some people who consider humans as the way bacteria got to go to the moon. If you think about the relative priority of things, right? I mean, if you're a bacterium and you want to go to the moon, you need a human host to be able to do that. But ultimately, all joking aside, I'm just kind of get you to imagine what's possible, what you need to learn about in biology. And so the good news is there's massive, so you have to look at the things at cell level, of course tissue level. Inside cells, DNA, RNA, and many other forms of RNA than just the mRNA that's become popularized, small molecules that can be sugars and lipids and metabolites and membranes, and all that are the parts. So imagine a play with all of those as types of characters. Now there are 20,000 genes that can express themselves in the form of 100,000 proteins. Most proteins interact with another protein not once, but 50 to 100 different protein partners at any given time, just so kind of keep up with the orchestration of this. And these cells are, over time, dynamically kind of changing and then dividing and reproducing themselves. And that whole thing works like clockwork, pretty much, and we understand extremely little of how and why it does that. Now, if what you had is measurement tools, where would you aim it? Would you need to figure out every complex carbohydrate, every linkage, every amino acid, protein, as it varies? It's just this enormous, So one of the interesting, fundamental questions is, why is there life to begin with? Because the diversity of molecules, just amino acids, 20 of them, in the form of the diversity of proteins, is so vast that the instance we represent is, probabilistically, offensive, even to my physicist brother, because it should simply not happen. Simply not happen. And so, you kind of, at the edges of measurement, you kind of get, I think, perplexed with why all this exists, because it is such an unlikely event. In the form it exists, right? So the challenging part is, what do I measure? Is what I'm measuring worth measuring? what am I going to do with this measurement? I don't even know, because I don't know if the signal's in the sugar or the lipid or the whatever. Over time, over people, over disease. So
and it's a paradigm shift, right? Because we generally speaking teach our science students to have their research question first and then take their measurements. And here we're talking about...
exactly. You're making a great point, which I actually that's a great idea, is that hypothesis-driven experimentation, falsification of hypotheses, is an important discipline, but in this type of approach at the end. But in the beginning, if you need to have a hypothesis, what's the hypothesis? There is no hypothesis by which you're gathering these measurements. And so that is a frustrating and potentially seemingly wasteful thing, right? You gotta just kind of bet the farm on gathering all the information without necessarily being able to justify it. And that's why it took a while for people to get comfortable putting in the vast amounts of money needed to gather the data, let alone getting the computing infrastructure in place, hoping for some output, which is now beginning to be more visible.
Before we move on, I have a question for you, furthering the idea about higher education and moving this field forward. But just because you brought it up, the UK data and other countries, can you briefly address some of the concerns, ethical concerns, that have been raised by people about, finding, for example, those 320 hypothetical people with a mutation, and how does that play in convincing systems to contribute data to these large experiments?
Well, there's ethical concerns with doing experiments on people. And so the next best thing is to find people who already are an experiment, and if they're willing to contribute to science, explain to them the risk-reward to society of them being willing to contribute anonymously a basis that will save somebody else's life. I can't think of a more compelling thing for people to contribute data they already embody. They are the data, than being able to save somebody's life. The reason people volunteer for clinical trials by the hundreds of thousands or by the millions is that you figure, I may not be able to be saved by a drug because it doesn't exist, but if my life ends up contributing to somebody else's life, then by all means I'll take on the toxicity risk. And that's being done. Medical science, biomedical science is this amazing societal experiment in that people are volunteering all the time in making something subjecting to them be helpful to others, not to them. So data is just another instance of that. And I think the protections, certainly the protections exist, the technology exists. We'll always be worried about privacy, we'll always be worried, certainly in the US, about discrimination and insurance, but there's tons of laws that have been passed, and of course you got to worry about security, cybersecurity, people hacking your data, this and that. I think all of that is valid, but the payoff is greater than the risk of being, having those risks, because the payoff is people's lives.
Right. So communicating about that risk reward is also important to society, generally speaking. So Dr. Markides, you had started talking about collaboration between people who are studying physics and chemistry and biology and data science, and we have, in this very institution, we have so many different specialties. What do you see as the role specifically of higher education in collaborating with the industry or with other stakeholders for moving this field forward? How can higher education institutions partner?
Oh yes, I really think a lot about that question, of course, because it's important that higher education has a role that makes sense and that can contribute to society that others cannot do. And of course, the role is based on the fact that we have all the next generation in-house. We also should have all the disciplines, or at least connection to all the disciplines that could disrupt and could transform any challenge and solve any problem. So we cannot say that we don't have that as a stakeholder. Nobody else has these things. We also have a long-term vision. So we should actually utilize those assets. Now, when we come into to handle things like we talk about here, that has a lot of complexity, and it has a disruptive force, it has transformative, it really is touching upon all these things. I think that universities really need to be involved, and we need to learn how to be involved. It's also a transformation of ourselves, because we haven't really been working in that way. In order for so many years, universities have focused in the different disciplines and silos themselves because of a good reason, because that's a way that you can actually handle and control the experiments and hypothesis way. Yeah. But now when we need to shift that, we need to, for instance, in order for us to train these computers to be really good, we have to put in more and more data into it. We have to think, when we put the data in to train the algorithm or the computer, data mining, we have to make sure that the data we put in is relevant, that it's the right data, that it's open, and that it adds in a good way so that others can use it. I mean, all these things are very new for us. And I don't think that any of other parts of society is asking it from us either. So we have to break through some new paradigms, if you want. But we have to talk about data life cycle and really foster that life cycle, because that's the only way I think that we can be supportive for the scientists that are going to find these new possibilities, these new solutions. If the physical structure of large molecules are going to be something that we can actually do in the computer, we have to make sure that the input to the computer is right. It's open and it's adding on so more and more possibilities that we can focus on certain small diversities and find the solutions there. So now another thing that I want to say in this context is that yes, we want to look at the complex problems from a data perspective, or with glasses that are from data transformation perspective. But it's hard. The people that are easiest to handle this are the people that knows about the life science, the biology. They understand more what they are talking about. So we have this challenge that the different disciplines that need to see and talk to each other have very different challenges.
Different training.
And we have not really touched upon these intersections. But I think the word intersection is actually what could be a very important word in this context, because if we really put incentives in meeting between different disciplines, between students and researchers, between universities and other stakeholders, if we make sure that we meet in intersection, meaning that we meet like nature does, evolutionary, we meet so that we can think new thoughts and we can actually learn from each other. I think that's something that we should take into consideration in the universities.
Thank you. I want to pivot just a little bit to the concept of preemptive health, which obviously speaks to the public health in us, because the idea is about preventing illness before it starts. But you've written a lot about this, that the advances in biological and computational sciences make it possible to detect disease conditions before they're symptomatic. What kind of health reform policies, approaches, mechanisms does a society need to move and shift towards preemptive health away from our current models of sick care?
Great. Well, I think what we do within my firm Flagship, and I've been doing for a long time, is to invent new ways of detecting and treating disease, or preventing it in the form of vaccines, but it's all kind of within the current paradigm. And one of the things that kind of is frustrating is that we tend to spend most of our time working on the most serious diseases in their later stages. And that sounds to reason, because that should have the biggest impact. It also happens to be the hardest problem, because by the time cancer is advanced, by the time cardiovascular disease is advanced, you can do less and less about it, because it's a systemic problem. It's no longer contained. And so you might say, oh, why don't you work on it at an earlier stage? And the problem is that it's harder to detect, and it's harder to prove that you've done something about it. Now, it's easier to do something about it, but it's harder to prove you've done something about it because the changes are subtle. Now, push it even further back and say, if you were given an option, right, we talk a lot in the US about the patient journey. I mean, in the last 20 years, the pharmaceutical industry has invested massive amounts of money glamorizing the patient journey. And they, if you turn on television, you cannot watch more than 10 minutes of television without seeing an ad for a pickup truck and an ad for a drug of every kind. And so that's because they want it to be societally acceptable to take medicines. The problem is, if we ask you, would you rather be on a long patient journey or a long pre-patient journey? That is a journey that precedes you being told you're sick. Most people would pick envelope number 2. They would rather be on a really long, glamorous pre-patient journey. So you might say, well, what's a pre-patient? Well, a pre-patient is somebody who has a pre-disease. You might say, what's a pre-disease? A pre-disease is not health. A pre-disease is something that is beginning to approach a condition that will result in a diagnosed disease. And if you now get to the realm of molecular cellular biology, you realize that you don't get sick when a doctor tells you you're sick. You don't even get sick a week or a month before that. Most of these things are a continuum. In fact, your cells don't know they're sick, right? You tell them you're sick. They don't know you're sick. It's just a constant dynamic spectrum. At some points, the cell's trajectory of being altered, I'm simplifying it, gets to a point where it becomes irreversible, or it starts accelerating down a path that manifests as disease. So there's no such thing as finding a disease. It's just a continuum. So we choose to call everything that's upstream of the definition of disease a pre-disease. We call people who we could detect that have that disease pre-patients. And now all we need for them is pre-treatments, not treatments. And then you want to delay, as long as you can, the onset of disease. Or ideally, you want to derail it altogether, make it something else, not the disease. Now you might say, well, this sounds good. Why isn't this being done? Well, it turns out it is being done. Here's a good example of this. If you are over 50, certainly in the US where I have my experience, you will get a colonoscopy. Now what's a colonoscopy? What disease are we looking for? And before you answer colon cancer, we're not looking for colon cancer. We're looking for polyps. Yeah. Well, why are polyps a disease? Right? The answer is because a subset of them can become colon cancer. And so what do? When we see them, we take them out. Well, what did we just do? We pre-treated a pre-disease in a pre-patient. The effect that has had on life expectancy with people with colon cancer is dramatic. Same with pap smears, with cervical cancer. Wherever we have intervened ahead of the disease. By the way, same with statins. What disease are statins treating? Nothing. By the way, before you say hypercholesteremia is not a disease. Those of you who are doctors in the room, don't be offended. We made it into a disease so we could actually use cholesterol-lowering drugs that then in turn delay or prevent heart disease. Same mindset. That mindset with the new molecular tools, with the big data, with a certain amount of daring that's where the action should be, and a lot of patients, hopefully by the young people in this room, will change the healthcare paradigm. One last thing I'll say, and even you said, what changes do we need? Everything needs to change. First of all, the field of medicine has to allow for the possibility that they should look at early and not late-stage disease. That opening of the mind, that's not how it's being taught. Medicine, the prizes are not being won by people who are finding traces of early disease. They're being won by people who can make big proclamations for late-stage disease. So medicine has to change. The regulatory system has to change. If you go to the regulatory agencies and you say, I have a pre-treatment for a pre-disease, they'll tell you, come back when you have a treatment for a disease. Because we don't regulate that. It's called the Food and Drug Administration. It's not called the Pre-Food and Pre-Drug Administration. That has to change. Then who's going to pay for it? Right? You'd think that countries like the UK, Sweden, others would put a lot of money into prevention, and they say they do. In the UK, where we've looked, 2.5% of the annual NHS budget goes to things upstream of disease. 2.5%. That's the totality of vaccines and whatever fluorine we put in the water. That's 2.5%. What if, by edict, it was 10%? That would be $1 trillion market overnight. What would we do with that money? Well, so far not much, because nobody's been working on it. But that's how you signal to innovators. So the governments have to change, the policy has changed, and then finally you mentioned public health. Public health has been the tiny outpost which has been allowed to work upstream of disease, generally underfunded, generally disregarded, unfortunately, and we just paid through 20 million dead people and hundreds of millions of sick people with COVID a steep price for our societal attitude towards public health, which is horrendous. Now, we're coming out of COVID. In fact, most people want to deny it ever existed. Great. We're going to go right back to the same attitude to public health. We're going to ignore it, whatever it takes, because it depresses us, it saddens us, it worries us. We don't want to be worried, nor do we want to be worried about wars. We just want to... But the reality is that that whole field, if that field was 10 times bigger, and more importantly, we stopped thinking about public health as a one-size-fits-all, one vaccine for everybody, but rather to say, no, here's a subset of people that should really be affected, could be affected, therefore let's pre-treat them preferentially, so we start getting the right preemption for the right people. All of that is the next 30, 40 years, and I think if we succeed in that, which is a big kind of ambition, we will actually deserve calling this healthcare. Because right now, healthcare is just a euphemism for sick care. Why do you know that? Because you need to be sick to get any of it. How many of you guys get healthcare today before you're sick? I don't think too many. So that's the idea.
Yeah, no, thank you, and it just feels so validating from public health perspective, right? The other, I guess, follow-up question is for both of you, and I'm going to make it broad so that you can say what you'd like to say about this, and I'm going to stay on this and then pivot to health security separately. But to stay on this preemptive healthcare or pre-disease, pre-patient model, I mean, some people don't want to take advantage of that. We saw with vaccines, for example, and the colonoscopies, for example, are a brilliant screening mechanism, but in many societies, people aren't doing it because of a history or a culture of not wanting to know, sort of avoiding. And then we live in this world of the infodemic with social media and everything like that. So I can start with either one of you, but the question is, again, let's start with you, Dr. Marquez. In higher education right now, you have this institution here that is really focusing on critical thinking skills, right, to be able to approach that. What do you see as the role in terms of this idea of this paradigm shift? Where does higher education fit in this paradigm shift to go away from sick care, as Dr. Aфеян just said, and more towards this focus on developing policymakers, advocates, financial investors for this paradigm shift? I mean, it's exciting, but it's a huge challenge, right?
Yeah, we talk so much here about the value of computer and possibilities with the data systems, but of course it has that backside also that today we can actually choose what we listen to, what what influences us in our brain, and so we silo ourselves quite drastically, and so I think it's very important for us also to make sure that we are opening up and find ways that all the knowledge comes out to a broader society, because it's really also something that universities and higher education have been struggling with for a long time, also to how do we get outreach, how do we get the knowledge and out to people and also used. So I think that it has become even more important today, and will I would assume maybe even more going forward, because people choose. There is a kind of a human kind of force, I guess, to feel secure and to feel to be part of something. We are actually that kind of animals that want to be together with similar thoughts, similar, yeah. So I guess that we have to really, if we realize it and we build the trust among ourselves, that in order for us to really feel good and be able to treat ourselves before we get sick, we have to also get basic on knowledge, and we should not be afraid of knowledge, and we have to train. I think in this whole school system we have to train the next generation what knowledge is all about, and also remember that we have had a tradition for so many years, and it has been a secret tradition to really verify knowledge. And that is also kind of slipping out of our hands today. it seems like there could be alternative kind of knowledge going around and be validated in different groups. And I think that is something that, yes, we have to really help each other to stand up for. And I think there, the stakeholders of public, private, and university can actually should work together on this, because we need to really that is a threat to all of us if we cannot break that spell. So communication and really go out and make sure that we reach everybody. That's what I think we should do.
Any thoughts on that? How we improve our risk communication, how this whole data-driven bioscience takes on part of that educational role, if any?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the angle to that kind of strikes me, it's going to take some time, is that I think as a society, we are quite fatalistic about our health. We are obsessed about our physical security. I mean, we let governments find out whatever they want about our most private information just to avoid a terrorist act. But if 10,000 people die because of that infection, then that's too bad, because we're going to get sick and die anyway, so therefore it's okay. I mean, just ask yourself the question, why don't we care about our health security, which we'll come back to, as much as we care about our physical security? If one leads to your death and the other leads to your death, what's the difference? In one case, you could say, well, that person did it to me, that government did it to me, that gun did it to me. Who cares if it was done to you? I don't understand. Your life is no more valuable if you die from a physical offense than it is a health offense. So as far as I'm concerned, our governments generally should be expected to deliver health defense. If it was up to me, I would give health to the Defense Department in the US. You might think they make expensive weapons, but they also have massive intelligence capabilities. They do surveillance, they do prevention, they do education, they do all sorts of things, not just make bombs. After World War II, we kind of said, you know what, this isn't going to work quite this way, let's go upstream. That same mindset in health just doesn't exist. The more, we're still making stealth bombers for expensive weapons in case we need it. So I would say, as a society, now you're right, it's ironic that we're expecting even less of health security nowadays based on how people want to treat vaccines and this and that. But the reality is, I think that if we start expecting elected officials to deliver the safety of our health, like they do the safety of our physical body, and by the way, they can have access to private information if that's the case. Because if that information causes my mother to not get sick for 3 more years, not live another week once they get sick, I'd trade that any day. Who here wouldn't voluntarily give up privacy in exchange for affecting people's lives to the better? I think they would. But we've never been given that choice, because insurance-based thinking has caused people to say, no, it's going to be discrimination. So I'd say we now, you might say, who's going to listen to us, right? I mean, elected officials aren't exactly listening to the electors these days, anywhere in the world. But I have one ray of hope, I think, in a funny way, just like the cell phone landline example, where in parts of India, parts of China, they went from having no phones to having cell phones. They never put landlines. It is interesting to think whether in certain emerging economies, certain outpost villages in the world where it's hard to deliver healthcare, whether they might actually be able to get health security much earlier and delay disease so that they don't really have to deal with it for longer. It may be that gets taken up there much, much earlier. It's hard to prove, but I think it should be an experiment that's run.
Let's stay on this then. So can you define for the audience what we mean by health security? And given that we know this is not going to be the last pandemic of our lives, what are we doing in general for improving health security? Not just the individual health security that you were just talking about, but societally or nationally.
Well, health security, interestingly, was terminology that's been used loosely in the last 5-10 years to mean pandemic preparedness, to mean infectious disease. There was a time before this current pandemic where there was an attempt, we certainly tried to get health security to mean in general the security of our health. That is, this kind of not just against infectious disease, but against everything. the pandemic pretty much changed that. And so now security really means security from pathogen, communicable diseases that are pathogen-based. So what does that mean? That means how can we protect ourselves from what happened with COVID? Because you may or may not realize that you interact on a daily basis with hundreds or thousands of viruses. Your immune system is your main defense. And when some of those viruses mutate enough or enter your bloodstream or what have you in a way that your defenses are vulnerable, you develop an infection, which could be quite serious in some viral infections. One of the things, by the way, not to depress you, but I want to make you aware of it so that some of you young folks who are looking for a problem to work on, you will work on it, is that there is a gigantic increase in the knowledge we're gaining about the connection between viral infections and cancer, autoimmune disease, and just about everything else. Mark my words, in 10 years from now, most things that were now unexplainable, they will have some partial or not total. So for example, this year, a huge study showed that EBV is a major source of multiple sclerosis, EBV infection. CMV, cytomegalovirus, heavily associated with multiple forms of cancer. We know this anyway in cervical cancer. So all sorts of viral consequences. So health security doesn't just mean security from a virus, it means security from the health effects downstream of the diseases that it causes. So now, if the question is, how can we do better? That's super complicated. Yeah. Because first of all, the threat level is going up based on global warming, there's no question. The threat level is going up based on our coexistence with increasingly other animals and carrier species that are essentially transmitting more and more viruses to humans. There's no way to avoid that. The amount of surveillance we do comes back to this data problem. If you don't know what you're looking for, you tend not to put a lot of money into looking for it because there's no it. But we really do need to say, you know what, let's look for everything, and then we'll see if we can find signal in it. So that's one of the debates that is going to go on, is do you basically, like you could imagine if any engineer, any biologist here was given the task, you could come up with a system that would essentially collect viruses for a living in metro stations, in rooms like this, and all day long basically just sequence them and just register them, and if you see anything unusual, see if it repeats, and if you see anything more unusual, then go do something about it. Identify it and just tag it. That's being done in wastewater. You may know, I don't know how much you guys have followed, but in certain places people have been looking at wastewater, looking for COVID, and essentially the correlation between wastewater spikes in COVID and then a very short period of time increases in COVID in different strains is very, very strong predictor. Imagine doing that not for COVID, but for any viral sequence. So things like that are beginning to be talked about. Then, of course, you want to have the ability to have vaccines that are pan-virus, if you can. So can you have one vaccine that can go after every category, let's say sarbecovirus, of which SARS-CoV-2 is one member, can you go after all of them? Well, there's a lot of similarities between this family. Can you find the Achilles heel of each one? On and on and on. I think that we have to value life more to secure it in order to spend money to do these things. And my only conclusion, you might say it's weird, given what I do for a living, and in some ways we benefit from the situation that people don't take these things seriously. On the other hand, I'd much rather society values life more and invests a hell of a lot more in the science, the technology, in the education, in the information, to adopt we're going to coexist with these viruses. I'll say one last thing in this regard. I think the best way to think about what happened to us in the last 2 years is that a nano machine that nature made, called SARS-CoV-2, a nano machine in that it is a few parts that basically has evolved to be able to enter human cells through a human receptor, and once in, make a lot of copies of itself and then spread itself like many viruses. But that nano machine basically was up against a human-constructed nano machine called a vaccine. Right. And the vaccine delivered information to our immune system to better combat the nano machine that would otherwise have gone against our immune system. And if you look at any data, I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, the risk of hospitalization and death is, if not 100 times lower, then 50 times lower, depending on the variants. But it's gigantic. Any curve you look at, you get a curve like this, and then you get a curve like this. as to, okay. So, but what's interesting is it's kind of like science against science. It's natural science, an RNA virus, against a man-made science, an mRNA-based vaccine. They actually look the same. LMPs look like viral capsids, and they're going at it inside our bodies. It's the ultimate mask. It's interesting from a pure scientific standpoint that humans now know enough biology, now know enough technology, that actually, if you go after one of them, you can go after all of them. But you have to have the will, and you have to have the capital, and whether we're going to do that or not, I really have doubts about, which is worrisome.
It is worrisome. Because of time, and on that note, I'm just going to ask for Dr. Arman Voskirichan, who's the co-founder and chairman of the board of trustees for HENAR, to make a comment about why HENAR co-sponsored this and a little bit about your support.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, on behalf of HENAR Foundation, co-founded by Dr. Nubara and Ruben Vardanyan, I would like to thank AUA for co-organizing and hosting this event. And let me also thank Dr. Marquides and Dr. Aфеян for the great session. Let me comment on the importance of topics we are discussing today for Armenia. And let me pick just one of the themes, health, security, and preemptive health. For some of us sitting here, you can think, okay, why it should be relevant for Armenia, because we have so many burning issues and it's probably kind of a future which is not relevant for us. In fact, this is very relevant, and let me use just a few numbers as an example. 9 out of 10 deaths in Armenia are caused by non-communicable diseases. Diabetes, oncology, cardiovascular. In fact, cardiovascular alone should be responsible for more than 50% of all deaths in Armenia. Any citizen in Armenia has a probability of 25% of premature death from non-communicable diseases. And lastly, but also very important, non-communicable diseases is a huge financial burden. Almost 7% of GDP in Armenia is actually the cost of non-communicable diseases. And it was mentioned that paradigm shift will be required to adopt the preemptive medicine concept. And in Armenia, it will require significant efforts, but the price will be huge. It's a quality of life of Armenian citizens, and in fact, we can maximize the contribution of individual into the society because people will live longer and healthier. It was also mentioned that significant change will be required, and why Armenia have a chance to be part of this change. Probably because of the fact, Dr. Aфеян mentioned it already, because the level of, as you call it, sick care is not so high in Armenia, and probably it also provides an opportunity or clean slate to implement this type of new transformative approach. This is also very important in terms of the opportunity for the collaboration between public and private sectors. To implement this type of change, actually significant efforts will be required in regulatory, in funding model, in changing the education system. So it's truly transformational change, and the role of such institutions like AUA, working together with private sector, with HENAR, with leading industry companies like Flagship Pioneering, and together with government, will be critical success factor for this type of transformation. And today's discussion, I think, a fantastic first step, probably small but very important, and I would like to thank you for this opportunity to create this bright future for our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that many of you have written your questions on a card. We won't have time to get to all of them, but I would like to ask Dr. Petrosyan to come up, if you would, to the lectern and just ask our panelists a couple of questions or thoughts on a couple of the questions that came from the audience. And as Dr. Petrosyan mentioned earlier, these questions will be collated and utilized for offerings for future seminars and series here at the university.
I'll ask a question that both presenters could have comments about. One of the questions was about the ethical dilemma, what is the border between pre-treatment and also and not interfering inappropriately with the nature, like designing babies, something like this.
Well, I think that any technology, any capability also can be used for bad, and it is incumbent on societies to discuss that and create boundaries. And it's also even more incumbent on the scientists and the health professionals who develop these capabilities to actually engage in that. It's not up to regulators to just, you know what the right thing to do is, even if you're inventing a technology. So I think those safeguards can be put in place, and they are being put in place. A good example is CRISPR technology, right? So the gene editing technology that's been developed in the last decade, there was a self-regulation imposed by the scientists, not by governments, that basically said do not work on it as it relates to kind of creating designer babies. And all but one Chinese scientist followed that, and the one Chinese scientist that didn't basically lost their license, basically was jailed. And so I think that works. Generally, we have to be willing to both self-regulate and be willing to be regulated. If we don't self-regulate, it is regulated on us in order to achieve the benefits of some of these capabilities. That would be my situation.
Thank you. I think also that from a university's perspective, I think it's important to really evaluate what are the channels that people are looking at, and also to be more communicative with all the people, so that we reach out and influence people, especially at young age. So.
Thank you. And Lilith Nersesyan from Armenian Bioinformatics Institute asks, which one of the listed two would bring more competitive edge to Armenia? Working with data that is unique to Armenian biodiversity, or working on algorithms that could provide opportunities for worldwide science?
My reaction would be the second. I think Armenian biodiversity will always be unique, but if I was going to get to something that's relevant to the world, I'd get to the second one first, because it'll be also relevant to the world. And then we can take the proceeds from what we've contributed to the world and apply it to Armenian. Whereas the converse isn't true. The world will not wait for us to be done with our biodiversity. So if we have to pick an order, we may not need to, but if we do, I would say, that's the beauty of data science and bioscience for this country, is going to be that the whole world is your experimental medium, and you get to actually extract value out of it. If you learn how to do that better than others, it's valuable overnight.
I also think that I agree 100% to that, and also a small country also need to, even also in this area, think about export. And also for Armenians, it's really good also to be known outside of the Armenian community, so that would also solve that problem. So that's great. Yeah, and then we could do work on the specific things here after that.
Thank you very much, and I will keep the other questions. Maybe during the, after the event, you can handle them. Kim, please.
We've decided as a group for one last concluding question, and that's for each of you, just to give advice to the members of the audience here. What advice do you have for them as they move forward in their careers, for ways that they can contribute to the conversation and contribute to moving this field forward, not just in Armenia, of course, as you just said, but globally as well?
Yes, of course, to make sure that you are encouraging everybody, all the young people, to study science and engineering and data science, and also to come to the university. That is definitely something that you should encourage, because this is it's not really a long-term effort. That will go quite fast if we start to really encourage knowledge building. And I also think that if you're part of a public or private actors, I think really to start to see and learn about what we can do in the other sectors, in the other stakeholders, so that to build trust is, of course, the most important thing to do right now, that we start to collaborate across the different kinds of borders. And why not start to be more collaborative and understand the public, private, and university stakeholders' different advantages?
So let me kind of offer a complementary view, especially for people who are studying, etc. So I would say, think of what you're doing now and for the rest of your life as acquiring knowledge, applying knowledge, and creating knowledge. The creating knowledge is the scientific process of discovery, which is well understood, but it's creating new knowledge that gets to be acquired by other people and applied by other people and you. In doing the latter part, that is creating new knowledge, we're taught to think in a highly incremental way. The things we get to work on are adjacent things to what we already know, and we get to create a hypothesis and we get to falsify it, and if we don't, then that's new knowledge. I would argue that there's a whole nother way, and data-driven science is one of the ways to do it, to acquire new knowledge, to create new knowledge. And that is not to do this in this incremental hypothesis-driven way, but to use your imagination. This may be weird to think that I'm going to tell you imagination is an important element of this. And our imagination, or the computer-aided part of imagination, which is machine learning, as far as I'm concerned, is the ability to foresee what's the next science that doesn't yet exist, and see if you can actually leap to some new capabilities, new learnings, completely new things. I would argue that that capability exists in your own brains. We just are taught not to use them. So in science, let's say generally, we're discouraged from leaping. In fact, it is frowned upon. If you say something that has no connection to what's been said just before, you're considered unserious. And the beauty is, and that's why I think machine learning and AI is going to absolutely transform science, is that it will give permission to serious scientists to make the leaps they've always wanted to make, but which data which will allow them to do without needing to connect all the dots between the first experiment and the last. So use it, don't abuse it, but use it to leap, to use your imagination. So I think that the kind of, for the next 10, 20 years, those of you who are saying, I don't really like data, I don't like computers, I don't like whatever, think of them as ways to extend your own ability to imagine. Your imagination is limited by the number of things you can keep straight, which unfortunately for us is pretty limited. The computer's capability of keeping things straight and projecting things that may or may not be true is really infinite. If you use it in a way that then you subject to experimental verification, the landscape you'll cover is much, much bigger. That's at least how I think about it. If all you're going to do is hypothesis-driven, incremental science, that's perfect, that's beautiful, that's what will get publications. You'll have a very hard time publishing imaginary science, by the way. Just think about it. And yet, all of you know that most things that eventually become hard science started life as somebody's imagination. So if we discourage imagination, why do we expect breakthroughs? Except really gradually. So at a university like AUA, I would say one of the things that your Open Center for AI, Open Center for kind of health should explore is just how much do we do incrementally and how much should we dare to make big leaps and then go gather the facts to see if the leap is a real leap or not. And to conclude, I'd say the difference is leap, and even people will accuse that what you're talking about is science fiction, because a subset of the time, that science fiction will become science, because you will do the experiments to prove that it's not fiction. The rest of the time, it'll be science fiction. Who cares? If it's science fiction, you can feel good about your imagination. If it's science, you can sell it to somebody or publish it. So I would just urge you to use imagination and not suppress it.
Fantastic words to conclude our session today. We really appreciate your time and your vision, and I would want to say a thank you on behalf of everybody here and on behalf of everybody in the world for having used your own imagination and your company and encouraging the imagination of the scientists that move forward with the vaccine so quickly to enable us to actually get together today in a room like this. So thank you very, very much. Thank you, Dr. Marquez. Thank you to the American University and to Henar. It was a really great discussion, and we look forward to having more of them. Thanks.